Good afternoon, members and guests. This is a legislative briefing on Wednesday, January 22nd at 3:45 p.m. With us this afternoon, we have the Secretary of the Agency of Education, Secretary Zoe Saunders. We have the Deputy Secretary, Jill Briggs Campbell, and we have Commissioner Craig Bolio here from the Department of Taxes to give us a presentation on Governor Scott's education transformation proposal. So with that, I will turn it over to them. And as a reminder, we will not be taking questions at this event, and that we have an email address to send questions to. We will send that out again for members. So again, please welcome our guests.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Good afternoon. My name is Zoe Saunders. I'm the Secretary of Education for the Agency of Education. I want to begin by thanking Senate and House leadership for the invitation to present to both chambers. This is a unique opportunity that shows a real commitment to coming together to address the complex challenges facing our education system. It was important to Governor Scott that we do this work coming together at the beginning of the legislative session to share the details of the administration's education policy proposal. And I'm excited to bring this plan to the full General Assembly. Today, we will walk through the elements of the policy that is designed to build stronger schools and stronger students to support vibrant communities across Vermont. We know Vermonters care deeply about education. However, there are longstanding issues within our system that need to be addressed in order to deliver on the education that Vermont students deserve. And as soon as I get control of the clicker. Can I give it? As we're adjusting with the clicker, I'll just share what you'll expect today as we go through our agenda. This afternoon, I will provide a background on how we got to the current state, define what the future state could look like, and also walk through the methodology that helped us inform this proposal. We'll share the key components of the proposal and also outline next steps. This plan is bold in its focus on rebuilding public education to better serve students. This plan ensures that a student living in a rural community gets the same opportunities as a student living in a bigger town, that a student from a less advantaged community gets the same opportunities as a student from a wealthy community. Our current system does not deliver on that promise, despite the increased investments and good intentions. There is an urgency to act. The historic property tax increase has pushed us to a tipping point. Last year, 1/3 of school budgets failed. The worst part is that the lowest spending, highest needs communities struggled the most to pass their budgets. The governor is concerned that kids in less advantaged communities will receive fewer services and opportunities now and in the future. The administration is equally concerned about the affordability crisis. Vermonters simply cannot afford the increasing property taxes. This proposal will achieve relief for Vermonters while also improving educational quality. When most states face this financial crisis, they have to choose between tax relief and education quality. We are in the unique position where what is good for students is also good for taxpayers. As one of the top education spenders in the country, Vermont can be smarter about how we invest in our schools and students. We are left with a choice. We can either hold tight to our current system, which will result in less for our kids while continuing to increase property taxes, or we can change. Vermonters have demanded change. This plan is about coming together to build a system that works better for kids, makes our communities whole, and attracts more families to call Vermont their home. We can do this with a funding system that everyone understands and that gets property taxes under control. I want to begin by providing an overview of our current education system. The challenges facing our public education system are incredibly complex. We just can't make tweaks to fix the problem. We have to redesign the system. I want to walk through an overview and share some highlights of the data that we've analyzed to give you a sense of how we currently operate. This is an overview of our current education landscape. This shows you a map of Vermont with our current governance structure. We serve 83,733 publicly funded students. We have 52 supervisory unions and districts, under which there are 119 districts that oversee 287 schools. In some regions of the state, notably the Northeast Kingdom, large numbers of students are tuitioned to independent schools or to other public schools. For example, they may not operate a high school, and so they send their kids to an historic academy or a public high school. These students are included in the average daily membership, which is represented in this chart, but not in the enrollment counts, as we'll walk through in a moment. When we look at our overall enrollment trends, we see a concerning decline. Enrollment has declined sharply in the last 20 years. We've seen an over 20% decline in K-12 enrollment. Much of that decline occurred before the pandemic and is continuing. In terms of total enrollment, we represent that with also including pre-K and other special programs. That's declining at a lower rate, but mostly due to an increase in the number of pre-K spots available, not necessarily that there are more pre-K age students in our state. Career and technical education students are counted in total enrollment, and you can also see them represented in this slide. This data is collected through a different method. The number of career and technical education students served has been relatively consistent over time. Additionally, separate from total enrollment, in this chart, you'll see students served in other settings outside of public schools, including in independent schools and in homeschool. Independent school enrollment in this chart represents those students that are publicly and privately funded. And you can see in the trend line, this has increased, particularly during the pandemic, but has leveled out since the pandemic. A similar pattern is seen for home study. Next, we'll move into sharing the academic performance. The National Assessment of Education Progress is the only assessment given to students nationally that allows Vermont to compare our performance to other states. Overall, when we look at our results for reading, Vermont tends to score relatively high in reading compared to other states. However, we have noticed a decline since 2015, again, noting that a lot of this change also started before the pandemic, and we're moving closer to the average. As you look at our math performance, Vermont tends to score in the average, and we're also seeing a decline in math performance in the same time period. We will have new results from the National Assessment of Education Progress by the end of the month, allowing us to understand how our students are performing after the pandemic. In the prior slide, we talked about the overall performance of our students, but it's also critical that we look at performance by our subgroups. So looking at understanding the achievement gaps and how students from historically marginalized communities are performing compared to other students. And these differences vary by year and by grade band, but show a roughly 20% gap for students living in poverty and an over 30% gap for English language learners and students receiving special education services. In this chart, you see results from 2 different assessments administered by the state of Vermont, but we're continuing to see those persistent gaps. Next, we'll look at graduation rates. We report graduation rates in 2 ways. We look at those students that graduate high school within 4 years and those students that graduate high school within 6 years. What we see in our trend is that we had a peak in 2018-19 before declining. And currently, our graduation rates for a 4-year are 82%, and the 6-year graduation rate is 86%. In terms of staffing, Vermont has one of the lowest staff to student ratios. On average, we have more staff per student, which makes it challenging to achieve economies of scale. We also see that our smaller supervisory unions and school districts tend to hire more staff, and that those communities also serve higher needs students. We see another trend in that those smaller supervisory unions that serve higher needs students also pay their teachers less on average, creating a teacher pay inequity across the state. Next, we'll look at expenditures. And as we analyze expenditures, we really think about this as peeling back the onion. So there's 3 different ways that we've analyzed our expenditure data. One is looking at total expenditure. So that's all of the different revenue sources, including federal and state dollars that are available to our students. Then we piece out operating expenditures, which are taking out debt service and capital, which are not part of the annual ongoing expenses. And then we isolate the expenditure based on the education fund, which is what how the state funds our schools. And as we look at these trends, we really wanted to understand patterns by size of supervisory union, by need, and also by these different types of expenditures. So overall, when we bring together all of the revenue sources, we see that our higher needs communities are able to draw down more funds. But when we isolate just the amount coming from the state education fund, we're not seeing a meaningful difference. So that means that many of our higher needs communities are really relying on the federal funding sources to provide the additional resources needed for those students. This data that we're walking through is before Act 127, and we wanted to begin looking at the differences after Act 127. We've done some preliminary analysis looking at the fiscal year 25 budget data. And so in this case, we're really looking at long-term weighted ADM, where we're taking into account the expected need that we would see. We would expect, based on kind of a theory of action of our funding system, that we would see leveled funding in this example when we're comparing expenditure by need of our communities. But actually what we're seeing is that high need communities spend less. Next, we're coming into really bringing all these pieces together and starting to understand the relationship between performance, spending, need, and size of our supervisory unions and districts across the state. So on the next slide, I'll bring in the circles, and each little circle represents a supervisory union or district to show the overall distribution. In this graph, you can see that the color coding and the size of the dots represent something meaningful. So the color coding represents need. So for those districts that are higher need would reflect in the red or orange. For those districts that are lower need would be green. The size of the circle actually represents the size of the supervisory union or district. And so what you can see as we look at this chart is that some of our highest need supervisory unions tend to spend less. That also tends to result in lower performance. You can also see on this chart that in the green circles, which are representing those districts that are lower need, tend to be higher performing and lower spending. So as we look at this chart, people often ask, where's my circle? As you look at your supervisory union, but this is really to think about broader patterns as we are looking at policy decisions designed to promote equity in funding. And when we think about equity in funding, it's important to recognize that certain students have additional needs that would be more costly to educate. And so we would expect that within the system, we would need to provide additional funding to make sure that those students get the resources and services that they need to perform at high levels. So we walked through all this data, and I think it's important to now think about what is the problem that we're really trying to solve, and also what is the opportunity that we have ahead of us. As we define the problem, it's important to recognize that we have broad system issues. We have a highly complex school board governance structure to serve a relatively small number of students compared to other states and compared to other districts in other states. Our top-heavy organizational structure creates redundancy and limits resource sharing capabilities. Staff expertise is often not placed at the right level of the state education system to promote student outcomes. This can create an expertise gap, particularly in areas that struggle to hire and retain qualified personnel. As an example, a district serving a larger number of students may be able to hire interventionists, while a district with serving a lower number of students may struggle to find qualified support staff. Additionally, our budgeting system is something that creates some challenges in our ability to deliver high-quality education that's equitable. Hyperlocal budgeting occurs within a statewide education funding system, and that distances the voter from local education decisions. We also have variability of graduation standards and uneven implementation of the education quality standards. This creates inconsistent expectations and performance outcomes across our state. Our schools are operating within a community context. And it's important to look at some of the challenges facing our schools in relation to the broader challenges that are facing the state of Vermont. We know that our schools are contending with rising costs, healthcare and inflation, and an overall statewide affordability challenge. This presents significant pressures on schools. When we look at our overall structure, it's clear that we lack scale, and that can result in creating competition for funding and tension between districts, career and technical centers, and independent schools. The preference for small schools and small classes often constrains program offerings and the ability to hire specialized instructors. It's important that we think about the impact of these system issues. We see these system issues playing out in ways that impact students. But I want to talk a little bit about the design of the system. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And so we're seeing some predictable results based on how we are designed. We see that we're a very fragile system where many of our districts struggle to ensure operational continuity and have critical vacancies in their central office staff. There's a high cost of operating the school portfolio, and that can divert dollars away from students and limit funding to address deferred building maintenance and capital needs. The lack of scale limits opportunities. It creates competition for dollars, and it also makes Vermont vulnerable to shifts in federal funding and state economic changes. Inequity in terms of students' access to robust course lists, electives, sports, and enrichment opportunities are evident in the system, and part of this proposal is designed to address those challenges. We also see at a local level, there's often a lack of incentives and also a lack of support to address those challenges on the ground. We hear an urgency to act. Despite a long-standing and deep commitment to education, Vermont's current public education system is inequitable. Take, for example, two students in different districts that offer substantially different opportunities. One school offers 73 total course selections. The other offers 102 total course selections. There's a 35% difference just due to geography and budget constraints of those districts. In another scenario, we see two students from different high schools that attend the same career and technical education program, receiving different credits from their sending high school because of their different districts' graduation requirements. As another example, there are two schools in the same county. One has approximately 700 students, and the other has approximately 100 students. The larger school has 17 different world language courses, and the smaller school has 4 different world language courses. The Agency of Education designed our Listen and Learn tour to really better understand how Vermonters define student success and understand the conditions that are needed to achieve that success. We traveled all across the state and engaged over 1,000 stakeholders to really understand at a local level the educational priorities, needs, and concerns. What we heard through that process is that Vermonters believe in a holistic definition of student success. We also heard a statewide desire, a balance for unity and freedom. It's critically important that our local communities are able to customize educational delivery for their student population, but there's also a desire to have stronger statewide understanding of the goals so that we're all working together to achieve those expectations and rowing in the same direction. We heard consistently a call for equity, and that was expressed from Vermonters in terms of educational opportunities for students and a request for any policy proposal to really focus on delivering a range of offerings for all students, no matter where they live. We heard also that there's greater need and support, there's greater support and greater services needed to support our students receiving special education services. Within our Listen and Learn tour, we also recognize that there's limited funding. And so we asked for input around how do we prioritize our budget in a way that's going to help us deliver on educational quality and what Vermonters hope for and expect in our education system. And we heard Vermonters talking about the need to do more resource sharing, to look at regionalization of services, and yes, in some instances, to think about consolidation. And that needs to be considered in relation to providing more and better educational opportunities for students that also will make the school budgets more sustainable over time. We know that our schools are doing more than just educating the student. They're providing a well-rounded education. They're providing wraparound support. They're really a hub of community. And we heard a need to provide clearer and more coordinated school and community partnerships, and really thinking collectively around how we can support the overall education and wraparound needs of our students. We heard consistently that these issues are really complex, and it's very challenging at a local level to be able to address them. We're hearing a call for bold leadership, for us all to work together, but do that in a way that builds upon the strengths of Vermont and achieves our desired outcomes. So the message is clear. Vermonters are demanding changes to ensure students can access the same high-quality education, regardless of where they live, that our funding system is fair, predictable, and transparent. They're also asking that we get spending under control to avoid skyrocketing property tax hikes. So we can do that. And we can do that in a way that really achieves a future state that gets us to where we want to be. With this plan, we hope to achieve world-class education for every student, regardless of geography or their background. We want to focus on whole child education that preserves and builds upon what makes Vermont special. And in doing so, create vibrant communities where families want to live and work and thrive. And doing all of this at a cost that Vermonters can afford and sustain. To address this work, we need to take a holistic approach. We can't just piecemeal it. And so we've heard over the last few months the need to do this type of comprehensive reform. The proposal the governor is bringing forward has three primary policy levers. The first is education quality. Fundamentally, this proposal is about education quality and ensuring that we can provide high academic rigor, enrichment, and whole child support. And when we think about our funding system, we need to design our funding system in order to achieve that educational quality and do that in a way that's fair, predictable, and transparent. We also need to consider the scale of our system. And so part of this proposal will be recommending a simplified school governance system, considering optimum school size. And while we're doing that, also creating avenues for local engagement in decision-making. We know that Vermonters care deeply about education, and we have a great opportunity ahead of us. By addressing issues of complexity, scale, and quality, Vermont has an opportunity to make generational change. that will result in an education system that is more equitable, more transparent, and more affordable. These changes will strengthen communities, attract families to the state, and prepare our students to enter the workforce, while also ensuring that Vermonters can afford to live and stay in their homes. We took a very intentional approach to this work in defining the principles of this plan. The principles of this plan also mirror the principles of the Commission on the Future of Public Education and focus on promoting quality of education, equity, and sustainability. We outlined several key considerations, and these questions are really driving a lot of the work, and this plan is designed to answer many of these questions. These questions ask us about how we can reduce inequities in per pupil spending, how we can align funding and resources to student needs and drive student outcomes and success. How can we create more meaningful opportunities for students and support whole child development? And how can we design a system that's effective and cost efficient and delivering on the array of services that our students deserve? And through this process, how do we also ensure that every student has a highly qualified teacher in a safe, healthy, and welcoming school environment? These questions helped to develop this proposal. And I'll share a little bit now as we get into the proposal, some of the specifics and also the methodology that got us here. I've already mentioned that last year was unprecedented in the number of school budgets that failed. 33% of fiscal year 25 budgets were voted down, and this happened in many high needs communities. Last year, the General Assembly also commissioned a research study from Picus and Auden to evaluate a better way for the state of Vermont to deliver education at scale and with higher quality. And later in the legislative session, the General Assembly established the Commission on the Future of Public Education to bring stakeholders together to understand the problems and make concrete recommendations. The preliminary findings were shared with the General Assembly. And I think one of the most salient findings was that there's no silver bullet to this problem. This requires a comprehensive approach that does look at all of these policy levers that are in the plan. Our Listen and Learn tour really helped us to understand what matters most to Vermonters. And we heard a lot of consistency with some of the trends that we're seeing in the data, the quantitative data. All along the process of the Listen and Learn tour, the agency has produced reports to share our learning and to bring considerations to the table as we develop this proposal. We also contracted with APA Consulting, a national expert in education finance, who also has a really deep understanding of Vermont. And we've been working with APA Consulting to look at the research, to analyze national trends, and also to build on a lot of the work that's happened here in Vermont to inform this plan. So at this point, we're going to go through the specific policy levers of the plan. We'll start with the funding transformation component. And it's critical that we look at this in the context of our current state and how we actually fund schools. The way that we fund schools in the state of Vermont is very different than other states. Most states will define how much that they will spend on education, and then districts work within those parameters to align their budgets to meet the needs of their students. In Vermont, local districts determine how much to spend, and then the state is required to fully fund those costs. That creates challenges as we think about the predictability of the system over time. It also creates challenges when we think about the timeline of this cycle, because the state of Vermont's funding system starts earlier and ends earlier. And so we begin planning the budget when we don't have all the inputs available to do some of the strategic decision-making that is required. Our current system is designed with taxpayer equity in mind. The current system gives the ability to spend more funds, but does not guarantee the delivery of more funds for students that have greater needs. We have the ability to, with this plan, ensure that students that have similar needs receive similar resources. And in our current system, we're seeing that communities with higher needs tend to spend less. And we know that there are some communities whose taxpayers simply can't afford more. So they keep their spending low in hopes of smaller tax increases. But too often, the communities that have more can afford more, so they spend more. And those higher spenders can actually increase the rates of those districts whose kids and teachers are getting less. And if everyone in the system took advantage of the taxpayer capacity, our overall system would cost considerably more. Our proposed funding formula is moving to a foundation formula. This will reverse the way we budget by allotting an amount that is guaranteed to districts. And this starts with a very generous base amount and understanding that we will need to add weights to account for different needs of students. The biggest takeaway as we think about this approach is the ability for us to ensure our students receive the same level of resources to meet their needs regardless of where they live. In addition to the foundation formula, there will continue to be categorical funds for things such as special education. I want to emphasize that the proposal includes a very generous base funding amount when compared to spending in other states, but it still allows us to achieve cost savings and deliver on what values most to Vermonters. Ultimately, budgeting is a representation of what we value, and we can invest our dollars in ways to allow us to achieve system goals and so that students have more. In this process, we can redesign funding in these ways to prioritize expanding early childhood education, increasing after-school and summer programs in underserved communities, extending and enriching college and career pathways, including career and technical education, starting in middle school. Through this plan, we're prioritizing ensuring that every student can benefit from specials and electives like art and music and world language. And through this plan, we're increasing access to mental health services for students. Lastly, by prioritizing what matters most to the outcomes of our students, this base amount raises teacher salaries to ensure that all students have access to high-quality teachers and addresses the pay inequity for our teachers across the state of Vermont. Doing all of these things without changing how we deliver education would cost more. So it's important for us to think about getting to the right scale to deliver on this and invest in those things that matter most to our students and to our teachers. As a recap, our current state, we have 52 supervisory unions and school districts under which there are 119 districts. These supervisory unions and districts range in size, with some serving actually less than 100 and the larger serving over 1,000 students. They also range considerably when we think about the geographic region. And in total, we support 83,733 total publicly funded students. This is a map of our current governance structure. And as we move to a more simplified structure, we are recommending moving to 5 districts. So in this proposal, we're eliminating the supervisory union construct and moving towards 5 districts that are larger, span a larger region, and have collectively shared responsibility over a larger number of students, a larger portfolio of schools that also represent a diversity of student needs, ensuring that governance decisions are really promoting equity. For each school district, each of these districts would have 1 school board. The school boards are elected and would be paid as part-time. Each of these districts would have a robust central office staff to provide the type of regional support and services that are needed. This particular configuration was built upon the Regional Superintendents Association. That's a construct that has been longstanding and already supports cooperation and coordination for our educators across the state. As we look at the benefits of moving towards 5 districts, this allows us to rescale our governance structure. allows us to really think about achieving the scale that we need to deliver. That means reducing inequity in spending per student. This helps us to eliminate costly inefficiencies and duplication of effort, allows us to reinvest in teacher salaries by reducing administrative overhead, improves service delivery by operating at scale, and increases educational opportunities for all students. We also need to think about the scale at the school level. A preference we heard from the Listen and Learn tour was a desire to have comprehensive high schools where we were able to have a traditional high school connected to a career and technical education to provide a robust set of offerings. There also was a preference for more central middle schools, while also having a preference for maintaining small neighborhood elementary schools to the extent that possible. And so I think as part of this plan, we know that it's going to be important to consider how we make these decisions in a way that's going to promote quality for students. And this will involve and will require collaborative planning. It will require us to really think about how we best use our school buildings as those local assets to support educational delivery and help us to prioritize investment. Part of this plan will be intentionally designed to understand which schools are small by necessity and which schools are small by choice. Some schools will need to operate at a smaller scale and serve fewer students because they operate in very rural areas where there may be long commute times for them to get to another school. And part of this plan is being very practical and intentional about defining that criteria. When we think about school scale, the North Star here is around quality. And so as part of this plan would be measuring the viability of the school system in two ways and thinking about the financial viability. And that's important to ensure sustainability and to be able to continue to operate and deliver high quality education, and also to evaluate quality. We talked through a governance structure where the school districts have a broader geographic region to share in responsibility around decision-making. And it's also important for us to create opportunities for that local input at the school level. This plan proposes the creation of school advisory councils. These would be required for every school and would involve representation from caregivers and educators and students, along with community partners. And these advisory councils would be responsible for approving the school improvement plan, which is a federal and state requirement, and also providing input on the budget development to ensure that there's equitable delivery. And in these decisions, you're going to see more of a day-to-day impact of the local decisions on what students receive in the classroom. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Bolio to talk about the tax considerations.
Thank you, Secretary. So let's talk a little about the challenges of the current funding system, right? Number one, it's super complicated, right? It's very difficult for Vermonters and other stakeholders to understand and follow how the system works. One of the few cost containment mechanisms in the current system is local control, but that's undermined by the system being so complicated that few can understand it. If people can't understand or tie what their vote means to their tax bill, it's difficult to ensure that they can make an informed decision. There's also little budgeting control for the state. In other states and in the general fund, we budget to revenues, but in the education fund, we raise revenues to meet the approved budgets. And property taxes end up being the shock absorber for whatever the difference is between available non-property tax revenues and aggregated education fund expenditures. But coupled with that, there's little incentive for local districts to make difficult or frugal budgeting decisions because of the loose connection between their budget savings and their tax savings, especially if other communities around the state are not making those same difficult decisions. So we have a system that relies on local control as cost containment, is too complicated for people to understand, has little to no guardrails for the state to set reasonable limits, and gives districts few tools or incentives to find ways to save. We got a problem. This plan helps reform that. If we move to the foundation formula in this plan, the system will be easier to understand. The majority of the foundation formula, after accounting for available non-property tax revenues, could be funded with a single statewide education property tax rate that applies to all property in the state. This plan reforms the existing property tax credit program into an income-based homestead exemption, which would have a multitude of advantages, including making tax impacts of budgets easier to understand and explain, both for homeowners and school boards, and allows the credit to be more responsive to property value and rate changes in a given year, which was a challenge that the General Assembly had to grapple with last year in dealing with the property tax credit and its lag against an average 14% bill increase. And this plan would allow communities to raise limited additional funds on their local grand list, while acknowledging that even with a reduced number of districts, there are still property wealth disparities between communities, and instituting a state guarantee to ensure that a penny on each district's local tax rate raises a certain amount of revenue to account for those disparities. So if we implement this plan, there are a number of advantages that we would realize over the current system. It's more equitable and fair than our current system because it ensures that students with the same needs receive the same resources, and it ensures that all communities around the state will have access to the resources they need to provide a high-quality education. The system will be more transparent and provide more certainty for voters and other stakeholders. Voters will be more directly tied to their tax bills, and this proposal could allow for voters and school boards to have more certainty about tax impacts earlier in the process. That's one of the biggest challenges in our current system. School boards and voters today do not get certainty. School boards are building budgets right now with an estimated yield. Voters, when they go to vote, are using an estimated yield. And this plan will provide guardrails for the state to more easily and clearly understand and oversee the education budget for the state. If we implement this plan, we can restore transparency, predictability, and sustainability to our education finance system and improve affordability for Vermonters while improving quality. Thank you. I'll hand it back to the Secretary.
We'll move to the next policy lever, which is improving educational quality. And as we've described throughout the presentation, and we heard clearly through the Listen and Learn tour, we need to strike the right balance of being able to provide the standardization to ensure that we're all working towards the same goals while allowing for local customization to meet the needs of our communities. We know that as part of this plan, we also need to strengthen the role of the Agency of Education, and we've heard requests from the field to be a stronger partner and to provide additional support. As part of this plan, we're looking to strengthen the implementation of key strategies, those things that are most critical to driving student success, and we need to ensure fidelity, rigor, and consistency. We'll work to create coherence across curriculum, proficiency-based learning, and local and state assessments, along with grading. And we want to look for statewide standards for graduation requirements and a coordinated curriculum to ensure that we're consistently measuring that our students are ready to succeed after high school graduation. Part of this plan will also be adopting a single statewide calendar to address many of the barriers as we think about opportunities for students to explore flexible pathways. This plan will focus on those high leverage education standards and ensure that the agency can provide support and oversight. All of the changes that we've talked about are pretty comprehensive and will require a lot of targeted support. And so the success of the plan will also involve aligning rulemaking to ensure that the agency is able to design rules and implement them in a way that provides the support to the field in an expeditious way that is truly a partner in this work. As we developed this plan, it was really important that it was informed by input from Vermonters all across the state, and that we looked at research and data to inform this. That will need to continue. We look forward to the continued collaboration with lawmakers and the community, because we know that there's going to be refinement needed to the plan to deliver on the promise to our students. Governor Scott's plan is committed to public education and also is an investment in the future of Vermont. And we know how critical schools are to our communities and to our overall state. And so with that, there will be tighter coordination as we think about working closely with our sister agencies, with the Department of Labor, Agency of Community Development, and Agency of Human Services. Government can only go so far. So we also ask as part of this plan and creating a call to action, asking businesses and nonprofits to join us on the journey to build stronger schools and stronger students so that our communities can thrive. And together, we will make our schools stronger, we will support our teachers, and prepare our students for their future, building upon what makes Vermont so special. And I'd like to conclude by sharing just a personal reflection. I know that the work that we're describing here is going to be really challenging, and that there's a lot in this plan that people may dislike. And as we were developing this plan, I wanted to share with you something that kept me going and gave me inspiration to do this work. And I want to leave that with you. A while back, I met students at the Rutland Town School who wanted to do something to improve the environment, and they formed a club to clean up trash around their school, and they also hosted podcasts to talk about environmental sustainability. Just really enjoyed meeting with the students. A couple weeks later, they sent me a thank you note, and they enjoyed meeting me, but they had a message. They wanted to share with me the motto for their club, which was "Little Voices, Big Solutions." And I was really touched by that message. I actually put it on our family calendar. And so as a mom, as I'm planning to get my kids to robotics and making sure that they're ready for their spelling test, it was something that I have continually seen: little voices, big solutions. And as I worried about the things in this plan that are unpopular, and worried about the things that are going to be really hard to do in this plan, and some things that may even seem impossible, I kept that message from those students front and center. And I think it's really critical for us as adults to really focus on these big solutions so we can amplify the little voices and make sure that we're making decisions that are really centered on our students. So I ask you to join us so we can be bold together, because our students are counting on us. Thank you.